The blood-curdling scream echoed through the night, making Ezra Haywood's grip tighten on the reins of his horse as he passed the Lawson residence for the third time that week. Val Verde, Texas, wasn't much more than a dusty frontier outpost in 1875, but its small size meant that secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Ezra had only been in town for 3 months, taking work at the livery stable while he figured out his next move. At 32, he'd seen enough of the West to know that most places weren't much different from each other: hard work, hard men, and the occasional burst of violence that reminded everyone just how thin the veneer of civilization really was. The Lawson place sat at the edge of town, a modest 2-story house that Thomas Lawson had built when he'd struck it lucky with a small silver claim 5 years earlier. Thomas was well regarded in town, a businessman who'd parlayed his mining luck into ownership of the general store. His wife, Lillian, was a quiet woman who'd come from back east somewhere about 3 years ago. She kept to herself, always polite but reserved, her blue eyes often cast downward when her husband was around. Ezra hadn't meant to notice her. He hadn't meant to care. But the first time he'd heard the sounds coming from that house, something cold and hard had settled in his gut. Tonight was worse than usual. Thomas Lawson's angry shouts punctuated the still night air, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone hitting the wall. Worthless woman. Can't even manage dinner without burning it. Another crash. Another cry of pain. Ezra dismounted, tying his horse to the fence post. He'd promised himself he wouldn't interfere, told himself it wasn't his business, but his feet carried him toward the house regardless. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Lillian cowering in the corner of the kitchen, her lips split and bleeding, a bruise already forming on her cheek. Thomas loomed over her, his hand raised to strike again. Something in Ezra snapped. Before he could think better of it, he was pounding on the front door. "Lawson, open up." The house fell silent. After a moment, heavy footsteps approached. The door swung open and Thomas Lawson's broad frame filled the entrance. "Haywood, what in blazes are you doing here at this hour?" Ezra met the man's bloodshot eyes. "Thought I heard a commotion, wanted to make sure everything was all right." Thomas's jaw clenched. "Everything's fine. My wife's just a bit clumsy, knocked over some dishes. Appreciate your concern, but we don't need any help." Behind him, Ezra caught sight of Lillian, her slender form trembling as she hastily wiped blood from her face. "Your wife seems hurt," Ezra said, his voice level despite the rage building inside him. "Like I said, she's clumsy." "Now if you'll excuse us, actually," Ezra interrupted, stepping forward, "I think I'd like to hear from Mrs. Lawson herself that she's all right." Thomas's face darkened. "You're overstepping, Haywood. This is my house and my wife. Let me speak to her or I'm going straight to Sheriff Wilson." For a tense moment, Ezra thought Thomas might throw a punch, but the storekeeper finally stepped aside with a sneer. "Go ahead, she'll tell you the same thing." Ezra moved past him into the house. Lillian stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her auburn hair falling loose around her shoulders, her green eyes wide with fear. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought, not just the fresh injuries, but older bruises yellowing on her arms, a small scar near her temple that hadn't been there when he'd first seen her months ago. "Mrs. Lawson," he said gently, "are you hurt?" She glanced at Thomas, who was watching with narrowed eyes. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Just an accident. You sure about that?" Ezra pressed. "She said she's fine," Thomas growled. "Now get out." Ezra didn't move. "Mrs. Lawson, if you need help, she doesn't need your help." Thomas stepped forward, grabbing Ezra's shoulder. "Get out of my house before I throw you out." Ezra shrugged off the man's hand. "I'll go, but I'll be back if I hear any more accidents." He left, the door slamming behind him. Instead of riding away, however, he led his horse behind the copse of cottonwood trees across from the house, and he waited. The shouting resumed almost immediately, louder than before. Thomas was clearly furious about the interruption, and from the sounds of it, he was taking it out on Lillian. Ezra's hand inched toward the revolver at his hip, but he forced himself to wait. Shooting Thomas Lawson would solve one problem but create a dozen more. After what seemed like an eternity, the house fell quiet. Lights went out upstairs, the bedroom, Ezra presumed. He continued waiting, his eyes never leaving the house until nearly midnight when a lone figure emerged from the back door. Lillian Lawson crept toward the well, drawing water in the moonlight. Ezra moved silently across the yard until he stood just a few feet behind her. "Mrs. Lawson," he said softly. She gasped, nearly dropping the water bucket as she spun around. "Mr. Haywood, you startled me. I'm sorry, I couldn't leave, not after what I saw." In the moonlight, her injuries looked stark against her pale skin. She touched her split lips self-consciously. "You shouldn't be here. If Thomas wakes up, how long has he been hurting you?" She looked away. "Please go, it will only make things worse." "It's been every night, hasn't it?" Ezra stepped closer. "I've heard it, even from the road. The whole town must know, but nobody does anything." Tears welled in her eyes. "This is my life, Mr. Haywood. There's nothing to be done about it." "There is," Ezra said firmly. "Pack your things, you're leaving." She stared at him, disbelief plain on her face. "Leaving? I can't just leave. Thomas would find me. Where would I even go?" "I don't know yet, but anywhere's better than staying here to be his punching bag. You don't understand. He'd kill me before he'd let me leave him." She shook her head. "And the law wouldn't help. A husband has rights over his wife, not the right to beat you half to death." Ezra took a deep breath. "Listen, I'll be back tomorrow night. Think about what I said. If you want to go, have a bag packed. If not," he shrugged, "then I'll leave you be." Lillian studied him, wariness and hope battling in her expression. "Why would you help me? You hardly know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered simply, "and because no one else will." The next day was the longest of Ezra's life. He worked at the livery as usual, grooming horses and repairing tack, all the while watching the clock. Thomas Lawson came into town around noon, nodding curtly to Ezra as they passed on the street. Ezra nodded back, keeping his face carefully neutral. He stopped by the telegraph office and sent a message to an old friend in Santa Fe. Then he visited the bank, withdrawing most of his savings. By evening, he had a rough plan in place, though much would depend on whether Lillian decided to trust him. Night fell. Ezra saddled his horse and rode slowly toward the Lawson place. As he approached, he could see lights on downstairs, silhouettes moving in the kitchen. He dismounted and tied his horse, then crept closer. Staying in the shadows through the window, he could see Thomas and Lillian at dinner. Thomas was talking animatedly, gesturing with his fork while Lillian kept her eyes on her plate. From his vantage point, Ezra couldn't see any fresh injuries on her, which gave him some hope that perhaps Thomas's anger had cooled. But then Thomas slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump. Lillian flinched, and though Ezra couldn't hear the words, the man's threatening posture told the story well enough. Thomas pushed back from the table and stormed out of the room. A moment later, the front door opened and he emerged, heading toward the small barn behind the house. Ezra seized the opportunity. He hurried to the back door and knocked softly. Lillian opened it immediately, as if she'd been waiting for him. "You came back," she whispered. "I said I would." He glanced toward the barn. "Where's he going?" "To check on the new calf. One of our cows gave birth yesterday." She twisted her hands nervously. "He'll be back soon." "Have you thought about what I said?" She nodded slowly. "I have, but Mr. Haywood—" "Ezra," he corrected gently. "Ezra," she repeated, his name sounding soft on her lips. "I'm afraid. I don't have anywhere to go, no family, no money of my own. Thomas would track me down." "Not if we go far enough." Ezra leaned closer. "I have a friend in Santa Fe. He can help us get further west. California, maybe. Thomas would never find you there." "Us," her eyes widened. "You'd go with me." "Just to make sure you're safe," he assured her. "After that, you'd be free to do as you please." Lillian fell silent, conflict plain on her face. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I need more time. To think, to plan. I can't just run off tonight." Disappointment flooded through him, but Ezra nodded. "I understand, but remember, every night you stay, I know." She touched her cheek, where a fading bruise still marked her skin. "Tomorrow night, if I decide to go, I'll have a bag ready. I'll be waiting, same time." Ezra was about to leave when they heard the barn door slam. Lillian's face paled. "Go," she hissed. Quickly, he squeezed her hand once, then disappeared into the darkness, making it back to his horse just as Thomas rounded the corner of the house. Ezra led his horse further down the road before mounting, not wanting the sound of hoofbeats to draw attention. The next day passed even more slowly than the one before. Ezra was distracted at work, earning a reprimand from the livery owner. He couldn't stop thinking about Lillian, her fear, her hesitation, the impossible choice she faced. He'd seen women in her situation before. Some escaped. Some died trying. Some simply endured until their spirits broke completely. He wouldn't let that happen to Lillian. Even if she decided not to leave with him, he would find another way to help her. Maybe he could speak to the sheriff or the preacher or anyone else who might intervene. Evening arrived at last. Ezra packed saddlebags with provisions, strapped on his bedroll, and made sure his revolver was loaded. If Thomas tried to stop them, Ezra was prepared to do whatever was necessary. He approached the Lawson house cautiously. This time the place was dark and quiet. Too quiet. Alarm bells rang in Ezra's mind as he dismounted and crept toward the back door. It stood slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, a coppery smell hit him blood. "Lillian?" he called softly, fear rising in his throat. No answer. He struck a match, looking for a lamp. The flare of light revealed chaos, overturned furniture, broken dishes on the floor. And blood, smeared across the kitchen table and trailing toward the stairs, his heart hammering. Ezra found a lamp and lit it. The blood trail continued up the stairs, and he followed it with dread building in his chest. At the top landing, he heard a faint moan from one of the bedrooms. He pushed open the door. In the dim lamplight, he saw a figure on the bed, not Lillian, but Thomas Lawson, clutching his side where blood seeped through his fingers. A kitchen knife lay on the floor nearby. "You," Thomas gasped, his face contorted with pain and hatred. "This is your doing." "Where is she?" Ezra demanded, setting the lamp down and drawing his revolver. "Gone," Thomas spat. "The ungrateful whore stabbed me and ran. When I find her, you won't find her," Ezra said coldly, "and you won't hurt her ever again." Thomas struggled to sit up. "She's my wife." "She belongs to me." "She belongs to no one but herself." Ezra backed toward the door. "I should let you bleed out right here." "You're a dead man, Haywood," Thomas threatened, even as his voice weakened. "When I recover, you'd better hope the doctor gets here before you bleed to death." Ezra turned to go, then paused. "And if you come looking for Lillian or me, I promise you'll regret it." He hurried downstairs and out of the house, his mind racing. Lillian had fled, but where would she go? She didn't know his plan, didn't know about his friend in Santa Fe. She was alone, frightened, and now a fugitive who had stabbed her husband. Ezra mounted his horse and rode toward town, scanning the road and the surrounding countryside for any sign of her. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, but there was no figure walking along the road, no movement in the fields. As he neared town, a thought struck him. The stagecoach station. It was closed for the night, but the next coach was scheduled to leave at dawn. If Lillian was planning to flee, that would be her best chance. He changed direction, heading for the small building at the edge of town that served as Val Verde's stagecoach station. As he approached, he saw a slender figure huddled in the shadows of the station's porch. Lillian. He called softly, dismounting. She emerged from the shadows, a small carpet bag clutched in one hand. In the moonlight, her face looked ghostly pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Ezra," she gasped. I thought you might not come." "I promised I would." He stepped closer, noticing the blood on her dress. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "It's Thomas's blood. I stabbed him. I know, I found him." Fresh panic washed over her face. "Is he dead?" "No, but he's lost a lot of blood." "I didn't mean to," she said shakily. "He found the bag I'd packed. He was so angry. He hit me and then he grabbed me by the throat and I couldn't breathe. The knife was right there on the table." "You don't need to explain," Ezra said gently. "You were defending yourself. But the law won't see it that way, will they?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'll hang for this. Not if we leave now." He took her carpetbag and secured it to his saddle. "Can you ride?" "A little. My father taught me back in Virginia. You'll ride with me. We'll head west, avoid the main roads." He held out his hand. "Do you trust me?" She hesitated, studying his face in the moonlight. "I barely know you." "I know." He kept his hand extended. "But sometimes a stranger is safer than the devil, you know." After a long moment, she placed her hand in his. "Where will we go?" "I have a friend in Santa Fe who can help us." Ezra helped her mount, then swung up behind her. "After that, we have options. California, Oregon, maybe even up to Montana territory. What about your life here, your job?" "There's nothing here I can't find elsewhere." He wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her as he turned the horse west. "Ready?" she nodded, leaning back against his chest. "Thank you, Ezra. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. No need for that. Let's just focus on getting you somewhere safe." They rode through the night, keeping off the main roads, following game trails and creek beds whenever possible. Ezra knew the basics of tracking and did his best to leave as little sign of their passage as he could. By dawn, they were 20 miles west of Val Verde, resting in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a trickling stream. Lillian sat with her back against a tree, exhaustion plain on her face. In the daylight, Ezra could see a fresh bruise darkening her jaw where Thomas had hit her. "We should rest here for a few hours," he said, unsaddling the horse to let it graze. "No one will be looking for us yet." "What if Thomas died?" she asked, voicing the fear that had clearly been haunting her. "What if I killed him?" "You didn't hit anything vital," Ezra assured her, though he couldn't be certain. "The town doctor will have patched him up by now. But if he died, I'd be a murderess. You were defending your life." Ezra sat beside her, offering her his canteen. Any reasonable jury would see that. Juries aren't always reasonable when it comes to wives who stab their husbands. She took a sip of water. "I've heard stories. Then we'll make sure you never have to face a jury." He pulled some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. "Eat something. We have a long journey ahead." She accepted the food gratefully. As they ate in companionable silence, Ezra noticed her studying him. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked finally. "The truth, please." Ezra considered the question. "My mother," he said after a moment. "She lived with a man like Thomas." "Not my father. He died when I was young. Her second husband. He beat her for years." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. "She finally ran, took me with her. We made it halfway to my uncle's place in Missouri before her husband caught up to us." Ezra's jaw tightened at the memory. He killed her. "Right in front of me. I was 14, Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Ezra, I couldn't save her, but maybe I can help you." He met her gaze. "That's the truth." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Thank you for telling me." For 3 days, they traveled west, keeping to back trails and camping in secluded spots. Ezra was careful to cover their tracks and avoid settlements. Food was simple jerky, hardtack, and whatever game Ezra could snare along the way. Water came from streams and springs. They slept in shifts, one always keeping watch while the other rested. Gradually, as the miles passed, Lillian began to relax. She spoke more freely, telling Ezra about her life in Virginia, how she'd come west to teach school and had met Thomas during a stop in Val Verde. He'd seemed charming then, attentive, nothing like the monster he became after their wedding. "When did the beating start?" Ezra asked one evening as they sat beside a small fire. 6 months after we married," she said, her voice steady despite the painful memories. "The first time he apologized, swore it would never happen again. I believed him. Then it happened again and again until it was almost every night. Why didn't you leave sooner?" she shrugged helplessly. "Where would I go? I had no money, no family nearby, and I was ashamed. I thought somehow it was my fault, that if I could just be a better wife." "It was never your fault," Ezra said firmly. "I know that now." She smiled faintly. "It took a stranger pounding on the door to make me see it." On the 4th day, they reached the small town of Las Cruces. Ezra decided they could risk stopping for supplies and perhaps a night in a real bed. They'd heard no indication they were being pursued, and Lillian desperately needed rest. "We'll say we're brother and sister," Ezra told her as they approached the town, "traveling to Santa Fe to visit relatives." Lillian nodded, adjusting her bonnet to better hide her fading bruises. "Do you think anyone will believe that? We look nothing alike." "Half-siblings," Ezra amended with a smile, "different fathers." They found a small inn on the edge of town. The innkeeper, a plump woman with a motherly demeanor, didn't question their story, though she gave Lillian a sympathetic look that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "2 rooms, adjoining if you have them," Ezra requested, placing coins on the counter. "Only got 1 room with 2 beds, the innkeeper said. "Will that do?" Ezra glanced at Lillian, who nodded slightly. "That will be fine, thank you." The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds separated by a nightstand. A washstand in the corner held a pitcher of water and a basin. After nearly 4 days on the trail, the simple accommodation seemed like luxury. You can wash first, Ezra offered, setting their bags down. I'll go see about getting us a hot meal. When he returned with 2 plates of stew and cornbread, Lillian had washed and changed into a clean dress. Her damp auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and without the dust of the trail covering her face, he was struck anew by her beauty. "You look refreshed," he said, setting the food down on the small table. "I feel human again," she admitted with a smile. It's amazing what a little soap and water can do. They ate hungrily, both realizing how tired they were of jerky and hardtack. Afterward, Ezra went to wash while Lillian laid out their map on one of the beds, studying the route to Santa Fe. "We should reach Santa Fe in about a week if the weather holds," he told her when he returned. "My friend Jackson will help us figure out our next move." "What sort of man is this Jackson?" she asked. "Trustworthy. He was a scout for the army before settling in Santa Fe. Knows the territory better than most. He can advise us on the safest route west." Lillian nodded, then hesitated. "Ezra, what happens after Santa Fe? You've risked so much to help me, but you can't spend your life running because of me." "Let's worry about getting to Santa Fe first," he said, not meeting her eyes. The truth was, he hadn't thought much beyond ensuring her safety. The idea of parting ways left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. That night, lying in his narrow bed listening to Lillian's soft breathing from across the room, Ezra admitted to himself what he'd been trying to deny: he was falling for her. It was foolish, he knew. She was vulnerable, traumatized, dependent on him for safety. Any feelings she might develop for him would be tangled up in gratitude and relief. It wouldn't be fair to either of them to act on his growing attraction. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with her smile, her gentle touch on his hand, the way she'd leaned against him as they rode. They left Las Cruces at dawn, their supplies replenished, their spirits lifted by a night of proper rest. The terrain grew more rugged as they continued northwest, following the Rio Grande for much of the way. The days were hot, the nights cool, and each evening they camped a little closer together than the night before. On their 7th day of travel, they crested a ridge and saw a small dust cloud in the distance behind them. "Riders," Ezra said, his stomach tightening. 3, maybe 4. "Do you think it's Thomas?" Lillian's voice shook slightly. "Could be, or it could be anyone." He studied the approaching riders through his spyglass. "Can't make out faces yet, but they're pushing their horses hard. What do we do? There's a canyon about 2 miles ahead. We can lose them there." They urged their tired horse forward, the animal responding gamely despite the long journey. The dust cloud behind them grew larger. Whoever was pursuing them was gaining ground. By the time they reached the mouth of the canyon, the riders were close enough that Ezra could make out details through his spyglass. 4 men, all armed. And in the lead, unmistakable even at this distance, was Thomas Lawson. "It's him," Ezra confirmed grimly. "Along with what looks like hired guns." Lillian's face went pale. "He'll kill us both. Not if I can help it." Ezra guided their horse into the canyon. "There's a fork up ahead. We'll take the left branch. It narrows, but eventually leads to a plateau with good visibility. If they follow, they'll have to come at us one at a time through the narrows." The canyon walls rose steeply on either side as they pushed on. Behind them, shouts echoed as their pursuers entered the canyon. Ezra pressed their horse harder, knowing the animal was reaching its limits but having no choice. They reached the fork and turned left as planned. The passage narrowed dramatically, barely wide enough for their horse to pass through. The walls towered above them, blocking the afternoon sun and casting the passage into twilight gloom. "Almost there," Ezra encouraged, feeling Lillian's tension as she sat before him. "Just a little further." The narrow passage eventually opened onto a small plateau, ringed by rock formations that provided natural cover. Ezra helped Lillian dismount, then led the exhausted horse behind the largest boulder. "Stay here," he told her, drawing his revolver and checking the chambers. "I'm going to take position by that outcropping. It gives me a clear view of the passage." "Ezra, no," she clutched his arm. "There are 4 of them. They can only come through one at a time," he reminded her, "and I'm a fair shot. I won't let you die for me." Her green eyes burned with determination. "Give me the rifle." "Lillian, I know how to shoot," she insisted. "My father taught me that too." After a moment's hesitation, Ezra handed her the Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard. "Stay behind cover, don't expose yourself unnecessarily." She nodded, checking the rifle with surprising competence. Ezra positioned himself behind a jagged rock formation that gave him a clear line of fire to the narrow passage. Lillian took up a position about 15 feet to his right, the rifle braced against a boulder. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the narrow passage, followed by Thomas Lawson's voice. "Lillian, I know you're up there. Come out now and maybe I won't kill your cowboy friend." Lillian's hands tightened on the rifle, but she remained silent. Ezra caught her eye and shook his head slightly, warning her not to respond. "Last chance, Lillian," Thomas called again. "You belong to me, you took vows." Still they waited. After a moment, a rider appeared at the end of the narrow passage, not Thomas, but one of his hired guns. The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being the first to enter the exposed area. "They're up there somewhere," he called back to the others. "Can't see 'em, but this is the only way out." Ezra aimed carefully and fired. The shot ricocheted off the rock wall near the man's head, sending him scrambling back into the passage. "Next one's not a warning," Ezra shouted. Curses echoed from the passage. After a brief conference that Ezra couldn't quite make out, two riders emerged simultaneously, spurring their horses hard in an attempt to reach the plateau before Ezra could pick them off. Ezra fired, hitting the first rider in the shoulder. The man tumbled from his horse but managed to scramble behind a boulder. The second rider, Thomas Lawson himself, made it to cover on the opposite side of the plateau, his revolver already drawn. "You're outnumbered, Haywood," Thomas shouted. "Give me back my wife and maybe I'll let you live." "She's not your property, Lawson," Ezra called back, ducking as a bullet whizzed over his head. The third hired gun used the distraction to charge through the passage, but Lillian was ready. Her rifle cracked and the man clutched his leg, his horse rearing in panic. He managed to stay mounted but retreated back into the passage. "Nice shot," Ezra murmured admiringly. "My father wanted sons," she replied with a grim smile. The standoff continued, with occasional exchanges of gunfire but no clear advantage for either side. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plateau. "We can't stay here all night," Lillian whispered during a lull. "We'll run out of ammunition before they do." "I know," Ezra responded, keeping his eyes on Thomas's position, "but they can't flank us. As long as we control the passage, we have the advantage." As if on cue, a movement caught his eye, the fourth man, who had somehow scaled the canyon wall and was now working his way along a narrow ledge that would bring him behind their position. Ezra swung his revolver around and fired twice in quick succession. The first shot missed, but the second caught the climber in the arm. He lost his balance, tumbling from the ledge to land with a sickening thud on the rocks below. "Damn you, Haywood." Thomas roared, firing wildly in Ezra's direction. Ezra ducked, but not quickly enough. A bullet grazed his upper arm, tearing through his shirt and leaving a burning furrow in his flesh. He hissed in pain, pressing his hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Ezra." Lillian's face was tight with concern. "How bad is it?" "Just a graze," he assured her, though the wound burned like fire. "I'm fine." As darkness fell, the gunfire gradually ceased. They could hear low voices conferring from Thomas's position, but couldn't make out the words. Ezra used the opportunity to bind his wound with a strip torn from his bandana. "What do you think they're planning?" Lillian whispered, "probably trying to decide whether to wait us out or rush us." Ezra checked his remaining ammunition. "I've got 8 shots left in the revolver. How's the rifle?" 5 rounds, she reported, plus whatever's in the saddlebags. "Not enough for a prolonged fight," he said grimly. "We need to find another way out of here." They were debating options when a voice called out from the darkness, not Thomas this time, but one of the hired guns. "Hey, Cowboy. Mr. Lawson wants to talk terms." "What terms?" Ezra called back cautiously. "He says the woman can go free if you surrender yourself to us. Fair exchange, considering you stole his wife." Lillian grabbed Ezra's arm. "Don't listen to him. Thomas will kill us both if he gets the chance." "I know," Ezra agreed. "They're just trying to separate us." He raised his voice. Tell Lawson he can go to hell, his wife left of her own free will. Have it your way, the voice replied. But come morning, we're coming in there one way or another. And Mr. Lawson says he'll take his time with both of you when we do. Silence fell again. Ezra and Lillian huddled behind their cover, sharing a canteen of water and the last of their jerky. The night grew cold, but they dared not build a fire. I'm sorry I got you into this, Lillian said softly. You didn't get me into anything, I made my choice. Ezra's hand found hers in the darkness, and I don't regret it. Her fingers curled around his. Neither do I, even if this is where it ends. It's not going to end here, he promised. We just need to hold out until dawn, then we'll see what options we have. But as the hours crept by, Ezra's optimism faded. Thomas and his remaining men had them pinned down with limited ammunition and an exhausted horse. Unless something changed, morning would indeed bring a final confrontation. Sometime in the darkest hour of the night, Lillian shifted closer until she was pressed against Ezra's side. Are you cold? He asked, wrapping his uninjured arm around her. A little, she admitted. But that's not why I moved. She tilted her face up to his. In the faint starlight, her eyes shone with an emotion he hadn't seen there before, not fear or gratitude, but something deeper. Ezra, she whispered, if we don't make it through tomorrow, we will, he insisted. But if we don't, I want you to know. She hesitated, then continued in a rush. I'm falling in love with you. It's probably foolish and the timing couldn't be worse, but it's true. His heart hammered in his chest. Lillian, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Her hand came up to touch his face. You're a good man, Ezra Haywood, the best I've ever known. Before he could respond, she leaned in and kissed him, her lips soft against his. For a moment, he forgot about Thomas Lawson, forgot about the danger, forgot about everything except the woman in his arms. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I've been falling for you since the moment I saw you, he confessed. But I didn't want to take advantage of your situation, she smiled. Always the gentleman. Not always, he murmured, kissing her again, more deeply this time. They held each other through the remainder of the night, finding comfort in each other's arms despite the peril that awaited them at dawn. As the eastern sky began to lighten, they reluctantly prepared for whatever the day might bring. I think I have a plan, Ezra said, checking his revolver one last time. It's risky, but it might work. Before he could elaborate, a new sound echoed through the canyon, hoofbeats, many of them, approaching from the direction opposite the narrow passage. Ezra and Lillian exchanged puzzled glances. Reinforcements, Lillian whispered fearfully. Can't be, Ezra replied. No one knows we're here. The sound grew louder. From Thomas's position came shouts of alarm. Suddenly, the plateau was filled with mounted men, at least a dozen, all wearing badges. U.S. Marshals. A commanding voice announced, "Lower your weapons." For a stunned moment, no one moved. Then Thomas Lawson broke cover, firing wildly at the marshals. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a volley of shots that left Thomas sprawled motionless on the ground. His remaining hired guns quickly surrendered. Ezra stood cautiously, keeping Lillian behind him. We're unarmed, he called, setting his revolver on the ground. The lead marshal approached, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard. Ezra Haywood, Ezra blinked in surprise. Yes. Jackson Cole sent us, got your telegraph from Las Cruces about a woman in trouble. The marshal's eyes shifted to Lillian. Mrs. Lawson, I presume? Yes, she answered, stepping forward. How did you find us? Tracked you from Las Cruces. Wasn't hard, you two left a trail a blind man could follow. He dismounted, extending his hand to Ezra. Marshal Roberts, your friend Jackson and I served together in the war. When he got your message, he contacted me immediately. Thank you, Ezra said, shaking the man's hand in bewilderment. But I don't understand. Why would U.S. Marshals come all this way for a domestic dispute? Marshal Roberts's expression turned serious. Because Thomas Lawson was wanted for more than just beating his wife. 2 years ago in Missouri, he murdered his first wife when she tried to leave him. Been hunting him ever since, Lillian gasped. First wife, he told me he was a widower, but I assumed. He was a widower because he made himself one, Roberts said grimly. You're lucky to be alive, madam. As the marshals secured the scene and tended to the wounded, Ezra and Lillian sat together on a boulder processing the revelation. "I could have been killed," Lillian murmured. "Just like your mother. But you weren't," Ezra said, taking her hand. "You fought back, you escaped." "Because of you." She leaned against him, tears of relief flowing freely now. "If you hadn't been there that night. But I was." He kissed her forehead. "And I always will be if you'll have me." She looked up at him, her green eyes shining through her tears. "Is that a proposal, Ezra Haywood?" "I reckon it is," he said, suddenly nervous. "I know it's fast and maybe you need time, yes," she interrupted, her smile radiant despite the exhaustion and trauma of the past days. "Yes, I'll have you." 3 months later, in a small church in Santa Fe, Lillian Lawson became Lillian Haywood. Jackson Cole stood as Ezra's best man, while the innkeeper's daughter from Las Cruces, who had become Lillian's fast friend, served as her bridesmaid. Marshal Roberts attended as well, bringing news that the surviving hired guns had been sentenced to prison terms for their part in Thomas Lawson's crimes. After the ceremony, Ezra and Lillian set out for California, where they had purchased a small ranch site unseen based on Jackson's recommendation. The journey was long but peaceful, a stark contrast to their desperate flight from Val Verde. 5 years later, their ranch had prospered. 2 children filled their home with laughter, a 4-year-old son named Michael, after Ezra's father, and a 2-year-old daughter named Emma, after Lillian's mother. A 3rd child was on the way, rounding Lillian's belly beneath her apron as she stood on the porch watching Ezra teach Michael to ride his pony. "Not too fast," she called, smiling despite her concern. Ezra waved in acknowledgement, his face tanned from years of working outdoors, his eyes crinkling with happiness. Each night, he held her close, marveling at how close they had come to never having this life together. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Lillian would trace the scar on his arm where Thomas's bullet had grazed him. "My brave cowboy," she would murmur, "the one who waited outside and told me to pack my things." And Ezra would kiss her, grateful beyond words for the courage she had shown that night, the trust she had placed in him, and the love that had blossomed between them in the most unlikely of circumstances. Together, they had built something precious out of the ashes of her former life, a home filled with love, respect, and the promise of a future unmarred by fear. As the California sunset painted their ranch in golden hues, Ezra watched his wife and children with a heart full to bursting. The long journey from that blood-soaked night in Val Verde had led them here, to this moment of perfect contentment. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, just as they had faced the dangers of their desperate flight across the frontier. For Ezra and Lillian Haywood, the Wild West had been both their crucible and their salvation, forging a bond between them that nothing, not time, not distance, not even death itself could ever break.